For perspective on this unprecedented visit, I'm joined by a former vice president, a former ambassador to Japan, Walter Mondale. Of course, he served as ambassador to Japan in the 90s in the Clinton administration and was there during other anniversary commemorations. Mr. Vice President, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
What is the explain what the symbolism is going to mean to the Japanese to have an American president go to Hiroshima for the very first time.
This is one of the biggest events in modern Japanese history. You can't put any other description to it. They were 70 years ago. Japan was the first nation to be on the receiving end of atomic weapons. The city of Hiroshima was wiped out, and within a few days later, Nagasaki was wiped out. And here we are 70 years later, and thousands have died. Many died of diseases they picked up as a result of the bombing and so on. So it's a big, big day, and it's been a big issue that hasn't been subject to much discussion. And now with the president going there and so on, this will be the center stage worldwide, I believe.
It's always felt like an issue that the United States and Japan, the leaders, always try to sweep under the rug. They don't want to discuss it. They don't want to handle it. It's in some ways remarkable how close of an ally Japan is and how close of an ally they became so quickly, given the destruction.
Yes, and that's one of the great mysteries of modern diplomacy. Japan, probably our fiercest enemy. Within a few years after the treaty and the rest, we developed a relationship that's in many ways the best in the world. And I was there for few years as our ambassador, and I'm not talking loose talk when I say that. This is a very central part of their life and of our lives, and the treaty is crucial to all of us.
What should the president say? It's not going to be an apology. We know that.
No.
What should he say?
He forgot to call me, but I think that he's going to express sadness about all the human suffering that was caused by the explosion of this weapon. And then I think he's going to turn to what can we do together and what can we do with others around the world to find a better way to avoid the possibility that these awful weapons will ever be used again. You know, when you talk about war, you talk about weapons, you've got to put nuclear weapons in a different category because they hold the potential to destroy humankind. I mean, these were two big weapons that were dropped there, and the damage has been unbelievable. But there are now bigger and more dangerous weapons around, nuclear weapons, and we simply have to find, if at all possible, a way to avoid this most heartbreaking and massive loss to humanity. And I think that's what the president's going to try to do tomorrow in Hiroshima. And I think the Prime Minister will be there to back him up because the Japanese have waited for this day for a long, long time.
And you think it's the right thing to do? Is there any? Did you have any pause when you heard he was contemplating this? Was there any pause? And let me ask you this: do you think this should have happened sooner with previous presidents?
Yes, I wish it had happened sooner. But everybody, I think even on the Japanese side, we're not too sure in those early years whether it made sense. There was so much anger, so much heartache immediately following the war that neither country wanted to get into this dicey question of whether they were apologizing or the other issues connected with the bomb. Now, finally, I think kind of a generation and a half later, our president is able to go there and the Japanese are willing to accept it. And both, I think we're saying big things to the world here.
When you, tell me what Hiroshima looks like today, or when you were ambassador, when you went. How much of the destruction can you still see?
You don't see much anymore. You have some skeletons of old buildings. You have museums with heart-wrenching descriptions of what went through. You can still, I think, when I was there, you could still talk to victims of the bomb who were willing to talk to you about what they're going through, what their families are going through, trying to deal with it. But to look at the community, I don't think there's much that reminds you of. If you see pictures of Hiroshima the day after, it's a moonscape, as was Nagasaki. Nothing left.
And you could argue that it's those pictures that maybe the world needs to see today. How important do you think to see them, to understand the power of these weapons?
This is different. These are not normal weapons. This is the most hideous weapon possible. And we've got to do everything we can to try to prevent a repetition of what happened in Japan. And I'm glad that the president is going there. I'm glad he's going to make this case to the world, and I'm glad that the Japanese are with us as we do so.
As you know, one of the potential major party nominees, the presumptive nominee, has been open to the idea that, hey, Japan and South Korea, if they want to go nuclear, that's their business. Obviously, there is a concern about a nuclear arms race in Asia as well as one in the Middle East. Could you imagine the Japanese government ever pursuing nuclear weapons?
No. And, we've had our alliance with Korea and Japan, alliances now for many, many years. And during the years that I was there, one thing that the Japanese always made clear is they wanted us to keep fighting against the possible uses of nuclear weapons. They're a country that was on the wrong end of these weapons, and they've never forgotten it, even now. And so I think this is the thing to do, and we've got to keep at it.
Let me ask you a little bit about the pivot to Asia and President Obama. Is it been mostly just about checking China, in your opinion? Is this where should the next president take it?
President Obama will say it's not just about China. It's a broader question of whether the United States should keep a more direct and significant presence throughout Asia. And that's what the president promised in his speech a few years ago. I think it was a good speech. I think it's a good point. But I think we're going to have to work on it for some years to make it really central to U.S.-Asia relations. And
you have, I saw recently you were okay or in favor of this idea of an Asian trade pact called the TPP. Yeah. Obviously, it's become a political football, in both parties these days. What do you say? What do you make of that? And is the Democratic Party should they be unified on this issue?
I think my statement was more equivocal than the one you quote. I have been willing to look at the Asian Trade Pact, but I'm worried about what's in it, and we've got to be sure that this is fair to everybody involved. And I hope we'll keep looking at it and try to adjust those differences before we go forward.
Do you believe free trade agreements have gutted manufacturing in this country, in the middle of the country? I mean, it's been the essential arguments of both Sanders and Trump.
I think it's been hurting. Now, in some ways, it's been helping. But if you look at the old traditional industrial part of America, they've really been hit hard by the transfer of those companies to places outside the United States. I think we need to look at this very, very soberly. and keep promoting trade, but try to get a much stronger way of protecting against this, what happened to America over the last 30 years or so.
I want to ask you a couple of campaign questions because there have been some comparisons to two campaigns you've experienced. The first one I want to ask you about, comparison, has to do with Gary Hart and your primary battle with him in '84, right up to the end. Everybody knew you had the numbers, but Gary Hart went all the way to the end. He won California on that last day. You still were the nominee. Bernie Sanders trying to do the same thing. Do you believe Gary Hart hurt you in the fall? Did that set you back, or is it overhyped?
Well, he did what he had a right to do, and when the convention met and it was clear that I was the nominee, Gary Hart tried to help me get elected and made it clear right from the start. And I'm very hopeful, that something like that will happen at our convention. Otherwise, these fights, these personal insults that inevitably are thrown, leave poison in the system, and sometimes it's hard to win because of the antagonism. When I was with Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy was running against us, and I love Ted Kennedy, but if you remember that convention, he ruined that convention, and he diminished the president's stature, and I don't think we ever got over it, and we lost to Ronald Reagan. I would say to all the candidates, be careful that in your desire to be a strong candidate, at the same time you don't destroy the capacity of our political party to win an election. And I'm worried about that now.
And one of the other favorite ways that various pundits like to talk about Trump is, Democrats are underestimating Trump the way Democrats and Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale underestimated Ronald Reagan in the 70s. Is that true, number one? And do you buy the Reagan-Trump comparisons?
We didn't look at him as a trivial candidate. He was a very strong candidate. Polls showed that. But I don't think we're underestimating the risks today either. Trump is a very risky candidate for the Democrats. But more than that, I think he's a risky candidate for the country. We just talked briefly about this loose talk about U.S. policy in Asia and in Japan with nuclear weapons. That's the worst 45 seconds in this campaign, the damage that could do. And I'm afraid if he becomes president, that the possibilities for wreckage is just endless. And so I'm hopeful that we'll get ourselves together, we'll get behind the Democratic nominee, and we'll really go all out to win this election.
So you don't buy, is there any part of Reagan you see in Trump at all when you go forward?
No, we knew that he'd had said a lot of crazy things in his previous years in public office, and he was given answers that wouldn't stand up to a panel of experts. But the fact was, people looked at him and they liked him, and he was very skillful on television, and he won that election, and he won it handsomely.
Yeah, well, some could argue you just described Trump in some ways. He's good on skilled on television. He says some things that doesn't stand up to a panel of experts. I mean,
fair? when I was giving that answer, I was telling myself the same thing that your question just asked me. There are similarities, I think.
Enough similarities that you think Trump could actually win.
Yeah, I think we're going to win, but I'm not taking it for granted. I think this is a very tough campaign, and it could be lost.
All right, Walter Mondale, former vice president, former ambassador to Japan. Thanks for your time and for sharing your knowledge about Asia. I really appreciate it.
Glad to do it. Thank you.